Say a quick reminder before we jump into our class. If you are interested in being a part of the discussion that will come after service on Sunday afternoon, we will pick a time to meet together. I'm thinking 3 o'clock, but we'll send out an email and see what people think. If you would like to join that discussion, please send me an email or a text. My email is deverson, or Deverson, one word, at emmanuelmora.com. You can see it there on the screen. And my phone number is 513-312-3167. Though I grew up here and I live here, I still have an Ohio phone number. So anyway, you can text me at that number. But if you'd like to join that discussion on Sunday afternoon and see some familiar faces online, that would be wonderful. All right, here, let's jump into our class. Well, hello, everybody. This is Pastor Dave, and we have our first Sunday school together. I wasn't sure what we should call it. Should we call it COVID class? Simple with coronavirus? Maybe just Emmanuel Online Sunday School would be better. Maybe we can come up with a clever name together. But anyway, welcome. I'm glad you're here, and let's take an overview of the Old Testament. That's what we'll do today. My hope is that this course can be a Bible backgrounds course, supplying interesting and important information that often gets overlooked at churches. So I thought we would look at important time periods and important dates. I know that doesn't sound super exciting, but I find this information very useful for understanding the Old Testament, right? Whatever book or whatever story you find yourself in, it's very helpful to be able to place it within the overall story of the Old Testament. So hopefully you find this information useful. Here we go, Old Testament periods. And let's start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. So I call the first period of the Old Testament the beginnings, and it's the first chapters of Genesis chapters 1 through 11. These early stories are sort of in a category by themselves, in that all of Genesis from chapter 12 on is simply about the patriarchs and their story. But we have this collection of early stories in Genesis that sort of cover a lot of time and get us up to the patriarchs. So, of course, it's Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah and the flood. These are the Tower of Babel, I forgot to mention. And these things, these stories end in Genesis chapter 11. Abraham is mentioned in chapter 11. So Abraham functions as the hinge between the two time periods, the linchpin. So the first period of the Old Testament is, I just call the beginnings. The next period would be the patriarchs and the matriarchs, right? It's Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob with Rachel and Leah, and then Joseph and all of the business down in Egypt. This takes us from Genesis chapter 12 all the way through the end of Genesis chapter 50. So Genesis focuses most of its time looking at the story of God's covenant with the patriarchs, which to me is that's very important. God's covenant with His people. The word testament means covenant. So covenant is a Old Testament idea of contract between one party and another. And the word, the Latin word for covenant is testamentum, and that's where we get so we have the part of our Bible called the Old Covenant, we have the part of our Bible called the New Covenant. And so that covenant is first established in Genesis, and with good reason, it is the focus of that book. All right, moving on from the patriarchs and the matriarchs, we have the period of Moses and the Exodus. And this so far is easy to remember because you've got the Genesis stuff, which is creation and Noah, the Tower of Babel, and then you move on to the patriarchs. That's Genesis. Exodus is primarily about the Exodus. So the main event is the title of the book. And the main character throughout the rest of the Pentateuch, from Exodus through Deuteronomy, will be Moses. Right? He's the leader of the Israelites, called to deliver them from bondage. And Moses is the main guy. So Moses and the Exodus takes us through the rest of the Pentateuch. So Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. After Deuteronomy, you come to the period of Joshua and the conquest. And helpfully, Joshua, the story of Joshua is found in the book of Joshua. Joshua, of course, as you probably know, takes over after Moses as the leader of the Israelites. He is the one who leads the Israelites into battle to acquire the land, to conquer the land of Canaan where they settle. After Joshua and the conquest, we have the period of the Judges, and that's helpfully found in the book of the Judges. Sorry, excuse me. I'm healthy, don't worry. The book of the Judges, or the period of the Judges, is a time when Israel had no king, and everybody did what was right in his own eyes. That's a phrase that occurs in the book of Judges. Some people compare it to the period of the Wild West here in the United States. Before there was law in the land, people sort of did as they saw fit. And so it sort of marks the transition from the conquest to kingdom. In between the conquest of the land and the kingdom of Israel, you've got this period of the Judges, which lasts quite a while. This period of the Judges. There we go. Where there was no king. And it sort of sets the stage for a king to come, because there's a lot of chaos, and it ends. Some of the last stories of the book of Judges are very, it looks like they need a king. And that brings us to the period of the united monarchy. So Saul became king either right around the year 1000. Some people say 1025, some people say 1040 BC, so 3,000 years ago was when Saul was king. And he was the first king. Right? Maybe you remember that Saul stood head and shoulders above everyone else. He was called by God to be their king. However, he fell from grace, and Saul was removed from his throne, and a new king took his place, and that would be King David. And then King David had a son who ruled after him. David and Solomon both ruled about 40 years. Saul ruled 40 or 20, 30. People debated. Which leaves you with a kingdom that lasted maybe 120 years, maybe 100 years. So the united monarchy, the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of God in the Old Testament, where they were all united, all 12 tribes were united under one king, was short-lived. Right? Our nation here has been around longer than the united monarchy of Israel lasted. Saul ruled very harshly. And as he was about to leave the throne, the leaders of the tribes said to his successor, hey, if you're going to be as bad as your dad Solomon, if you're going to be as harsh as he is, we don't want the monarchy. And he replied to them, I'm going to be more harsh, so wait till you get a load of me. And because of that, the 12 tribes separated once again. They separated into two kingdoms. In the north of Israel, you had the northern 10 tribes, and they're known as the kingdom of Israel. And the southern 2 tribes became the kingdom of Judah. And this is a little confusing because the northern kingdom is called Israel. And when they were united, all 12 tribes were called Israel. So the name serves a couple of functions. It's sort of like you've got New York and New York. You've got Israel and you've got Israel. Okay, so there were 3 kings in the united monarchy, and the divided monarchy, each kingdom had about 20 kings that ruled. So the divided monarchy was a longer period of time, and you had more kings. So let's just think of how long these kingdoms last. Solomon left the throne in 922, and the northern kingdom had their northern kings from 922 all the way to 722. 200 years is how long that kingdom lasted. And then they were destroyed by a foreign enemy. The northern kingdom of Mesopotamia called the Assyrians, or some people call them the Neo-Assyrians because there's some really old Assyrians before them. But the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom in 722, so their kingdom lasted 200 years, and then they were gone. The Assyrians had this policy of forcing its people to, its conquered subjects to live in a foreign land, to come live in sort of the Assyrian homeland. And there they would intermarry and intermingle with the people, and they would absorb those people into their culture. And the northern tribes disappeared from history at this point. And sometimes they're referred to as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And there's some great conspiracy theories about what happened to those 10 tribes. Most people who study this stuff think that they simply were absorbed into Assyrian culture. The southern two tribes, the southern kingdom of Judah, they remained a kingdom for a couple, almost 200 years longer, all the way until 586. This is when the Babylonians came into power, and they destroyed the southern kingdom, and they carried those people off into exile as well. However, the Babylonians allowed the Israelites in exile, the exiled Israelites, were allowed to live as a community in exile, and they could keep their traditions, they could keep their religion, they could keep their writings. This is why we have the Bible, because many things were written in exile. So, for example, the Psalm, "By the waters of Babylon we sat and wept." That was written in Babylon, right? The books of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, the last event described in there is the fall of the south. Well, that was written after the fall of the south, probably in Mesopotamia, where they were in exile. Okay, so that's the period of the divided monarchy, and that isn't the last bit of the story. So the Old Testament doesn't end simply with destruction and tragedy. The Old Testament story ends with a bit of hope, because the people do return from their exile. So you have destruction, and then around 70 years later, the people return. The temple is being built. The city is being built back up. During the Persian period, the Israelites were allowed to return to their homeland. And you can actually read about this in Persian documents that survive. Okay, so those are the key Old Testament periods from Adam and Eve to the Persian period when people are returning. That covers the time period of the Old Testament. Let's do this again, but now we'll look at key dates to remember. And I find dates are helpful for putting it in relationship to us. How far back in time does it go? So we know the order of the periods. When were they in relation to us? And also it helps just put a scaffolding around all of this stuff in our minds. So here are some key Old Testament dates. Return from exile. Destruction and exile, return from exile. Right. Here we go. Next slide. Important dates. 1446. I didn't put the date for the creation. The dates aren't provided for us in the Old Testament, although some people say they are. I thought I'd start with something that's not really debated. The biblical date for the Exodus is 1446 BC. So about 3,500 years ago, the Israelites were in Egypt, and Moses led them out. 1025, this would be the date that Saul came to the throne. So this marks the beginning of the united monarchy. So this is when Israel's kingdom starts. And the idea of kingdom is central to the New Testament, right? The kingdom of God is probably, if you could pick one topic that Jesus talks most about, this would certainly be it. Well, it would be one of them, right? The kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, as Matthew puts it. So kingdom is a central topic in the Old Testament, which gives us the basis for our understanding of kingdom in the New Testament. So the kingdom of Israel starts in 1025. That's the united monarchy. The divided monarchy starts in 922. So 1025 marks when Saul started his kingship. 922 marks when Solomon ended his kingship, because after Solomon, the kingdom split. So that's 922. As we said earlier, the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom in 722. The Assyrians were bad dudes. They were the first to use terror in their warfare. There's There's a lot of material on this that I could share with you. They would, I'll get a little graphic here. They would skin people alive. They would put their enemies on pikes. They would allow people to live, but they would cut off their hands and feet. They would kill your father and make you grind his bones. And they would brag about these things. And the idea is that they would frighten you into submission so that when the Assyrians came into town, you wouldn't put up a fight. And it made it easier for the Assyrians. And they conquered the north in 722. So that's when the northern kingdom ends. 586 is a very important date. The destruction of Jerusalem in 586. Pastor just preached on this. 586 is when Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians. This in Israel's story, there's no more tragic event than 586. The Israelites had this great confidence that they could never be conquered, that God's house, the house of Yahweh, the house of the Lord, was in Jerusalem, and no one could ever beat them. They were invincible, and yet they were conquered, and their temple was destroyed, and their way of life ended, and their world was turned upside down, and they were carried off into exile, and it happened in 586. So this is the low point. This is the dark point in Israel's history. It's really, really sad. If you've read the book of Lamentations, it's very graphic and it's gut-wrenching, and this marks that low point in Israel's story. However, there's another date, 539. 539 marks the rise of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great was a Persian king who conquered the Babylonians. And when he conquered the Babylonians, he allowed people to return to their homeland. And so that happened with Cyrus the Great in 539. The people began returning to Judah, to their homeland. Cyrus is actually referred to as God's Messiah in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah predicted that a king named Cyrus would come, and he's referred to as God's anointed, or his Mashiach. There's two people that receive this title in the Old Testament. One is David, the other is Cyrus. Of course, Christ is prophesied as Messiah, but his name isn't given in the Old Testament. Explicitly, it's not explicitly given in the Old Testament. So, the way you say Cyrus in Hebrew is Koresh. So the first Messiah is David. The second Messiah is Koresh, David Koresh. Maybe you remember David Koresh in Waco, Texas. Of course, he picked that name because he believed he was the Messiah, and he knew a little Hebrew, evidently. Okay, so that's 539. The next date we'll look at is 515. This is the date when the temple was destroyed. And for the ancient Israelites, there's 70 years that mark the destruction of the temple and the rebuilding of the temple. And numbers are very important in Israelite thinking. And 70 is a number of completion or perfection. So that was the time of its being away, the time of its departure was gone, was over. And now it was time for the temple to be rebuilt. And that happened in 515. 332... marks the date when another great king rose to power, namely Alexander the Great. And here we're marking the date when East met West. The eastern kingdom of Persia was conquered by a western kingdom, namely the Greeks. Technically Alexander was from Macedonia, but we'll say the Greeks. The Greeks conquered the Persians in 332. And this introduced Greek civilization and Greek culture to the East in places where it had not reached. People began speaking Greek as a royal language, right? Just like when Napoleon spread his rule, French became more common, or as the English spread their empire, English became more common. We're speaking English today, right, because of this. And the Greek language spread because of Alexander the Great. Jews began speaking Greek as a result of this. In fact, the New Testament has 27 books in it that were written by Jewish people who spoke Greek. So that's 332, Alexander the Great. Now here we've left the Old Testament and we haven't made it to the New Testament. This happens in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And some people call that the intertestamental period. Or some people call it the Second Temple period, because this is basically the time period when the Second Temple existed. But the intertestamental period, Alexander the Great. All right, moving on. 4 BC. The birth of Jesus probably occurred in the year 4 BC, which is funny for us to think about because it means 4 years before Christ. But our dating system is based upon the birth of Jesus. But the monk who picked the year for when that exactly happened was off by a little bit. Of course, they didn't. This dating system wasn't used in the Old Testament. This dating system was used. Our modern dating system was used after the birth of Jesus, right? So they looked back and started counting time from the birth of Jesus. And this has a long tradition, actually, this dating system. Using the birth of a king to determine the date was common prior to this. In the 10th year of King so-and-so, they would keep time that way. And we've been using the birth of Jesus, which it's been 2,000 years since that's occurred. Okay, moving on. AD 30 would be the death and resurrection of Jesus. AD, as you may know, is a Latin. It's an abbreviation for a Latin phrase, Anno Domini. Anno meaning in the year, and Domini of the Lord. In the year of the Lord, 30. So 30 years into his reign, you could say. So the death and resurrection of Jesus occurred 33 years after his birth. And then the last date that I will give here is AD 70. Now, this is after the story of the New Testament. But, like if you come to the book of Acts, right? And when you conclude the book of Acts, Paul is still alive. He's on his way to Rome. So that story ends before AD 70. The book of Revelation was probably written after AD 70. And AD 70, now what happened in that year? I haven't said yet. It was another cataclysmic event in the history of Judaism. This was the Great War between Rome and the Jewish folks. One thing that we don't quite get in the modern world is we don't think of Judaism as being a military thing. We don't think of Jewish folks as being violent. And we don't think of them as being folks who want to pick up weapons and fight people. But in the first century, there were Jewish folks like this. They were called zealots. They wanted war with the Romans. And one of the reasons they did is, maybe you've heard of the story of the Maccabees, the Maccabean revolt. Prior to the birth of Jesus, there was a war against the Greeks. The Jews went to war against the Greeks, and the Jews won. And they reclaimed their temple, and they had sovereignty for a time before the Romans came into power. And so many in the days of Jesus dreamed of that again, that they would kill the Romans and they would establish their kingdom. God's kingdom would come with a king who would sit on the throne and kick the Romans out. That's what the dream was. And so when Jesus makes his triumphal entry in the New Testament, people are very excited, thinking, this is it. Our kingdom's going to start right now. And when they found out he wasn't that kind of a king, they were suddenly disinterested in him, and they wanted to get rid of him. AD 70. Oh, the nature of the war. The war was enormous. And there's a lot that's written on this. There's a Jewish historian named Josephus who wrote an important historical document called the Jewish Wars. And we learn from Josephus and others that Rome sent 1/4 of all of its legions to Judea to fight the Jewish folks. And Rome at that time, they had a fort in England. They ruled the Mediterranean world. They called the Mediterranean Sea our sea, Mare Nostrum, because they dominated the entire thing. The Roman Empire was huge at this time. And for them to send 1/4 of all their legions to Judea meant it was a massive war. And this changed Judaism forever. Some forms of Judaism, like the Sadducees or the Dead Sea Scroll folks called the Essenes, they disappeared. The Pharisees lived on, but their form of religion stopped looking for a king, and it turned into what they call is Rabbinic Judaism. And that survives to this day. All forms of Judaism today are Rabbinic Judaism. And Christianity survived this too. You can look at Christianity as an early form of Judaism. Really, it's the oldest surviving form of Judaism is Christianity. AD 70. There you go. It's the oldest because Rabbinic Judaism began after AD 70, but Christianity began before AD 70. Okay, so now I have a quiz for you. So I think you'll do well if you've watched the video, but anyway, this will give us something to discuss when we meet on Sunday afternoon. Here's your first question. Who conquered the northern kingdom of Israel? Who conquered the northern kingdom of Israel? Second question. Who conquered the southern kingdom of Judah? Oh, I forgot the question mark on that one. Who conquered the southern kingdom of Judah? Which empire conquered Judah? That's a good question. Which comes first, the period of the patriarchs or the period of the judges? Question number 3. Which comes first, the period of the patriarchs or the period of the judges? Okay, question number 4. Over which empire did Cyrus the Great rule? Cyrus the Great was the king of which, or the emperor of which empire? Cyrus the Great. And last, question 5. In what year did Alexander the Great conquer Persia? In what year did Alexander the Great conquer Persia? All right, well, there you have it. That's our first material for Sunday school, and hopefully now you can internalize this and you will have a way of understanding the entire history of the Old Testament because we've spent 20 minutes together looking at these things. All right, well, I hope you're all doing well and you're holding up during this time period. I pray that God's with you, that He's blessing you and keeping you. All right, thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.